see. All right. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. So, guys, we are live with Yaron Brook. Am I saying that right?
You're on, yes.
Okay. Um, I have to ask, do you get people saying it's pronounced Euron like Greyjoy?
That's a first. That is a first. I've gotten every possible pronunciation, in the past, but that's the first time it's been connected to Game of Thrones.
So, gonna ask a bunch of different questions here, and please do stay tuned. Really excited. On Saturday, the 5th of June, we're gonna be having Euron and Vosh debating inequality. But let's just jump right into our questions here. The first one we got was from Musty. He wants to know, aside from Ayn Rand, who is your favorite libertarian philosopher slash economist and why?
Well, first, Ayn Rand's not a libertarian, so and you can ask me about that. But my favorite would be, I think, Ludwig von Mises. Mises, I think, is the greatest economist who ever lived. I think that he was the most consistently free market, the most uncompromising of all the economists. And yet, he also was not an anarchist, which I think is a good thing that he wasn't an anarchist. And he moved the profession forward. He had real profound ideas that really, I think, will change the world ultimately in the field of economics. So I would say von Mises.
All right. Jordan, as a free marketeer, do you not believe free markets are inherent to anarchy?
No, I think anarchy and free markets, put it this way, I think free markets under anarchy are impossible. Markets develop in the absence of coercion, in the absence of force. They develop where there is a known system of law, where the enforcement of that law is consistent, even if the law is not pro-free markets, that is, even if the law is not consistently pro-freedom, markets will develop when the law is known and is, again, practiced and enforced consistently. And there's some level of freedom, obviously, left. Under anarchy, you have competing law systems, you have competing enforcement agencies. You don't know in any given transaction who you're transacting with, what legal system they're under, how that will work, how you will resolve disputes. It creates massive amounts of uncertainty, and I think the marketplace breaks down. I also think that ultimately anarchy devolves into, or has to devolve into, I call it gang warfare. It basically, what anarchy does is it legitimizes the idea that force is something we can trade. Force is something we can, it's not an unmitigated evil. It's something we can negotiate around. And you have a variety of different agencies, force agencies over a particular geographic area. The one that has the biggest guns or the most influence or the most power is going to engage in a hostile takeover of the rest of them. And a hostile takeover of security agencies doesn't involve buying the stock of the shareholders. It involves hostility. It involves using a gun to take them over. So what you get very quickly under anarchy, I believe, is authoritarianism. You get the strongest, biggest security agency taking out everybody else, and it's a pretty bloody disaster in the process. So not a great environment for free markets to develop and contracts to be respected and freedom to thrive.
Barn Owl asks, how can egoism be formulated into a system of rights?
Well, I think it's the only way to formulate a system of rights. I don't think there is any other any other way to formulate a system of rights. And indeed, the weakness of what's called natural rights theory is that it basically collapsed in less than 100 years. And today, there is no conception of rights in our legal system, because the idea of individual rights has been emptied of all content. So today, people think they have a right to health care, and a right to my money, and a right to my labor, and a right to food, and a right to a job, and which is the exact negation of the whole concept of rights. So how does it connect to egoism? Egoism is an idea that your life is the standard, that your life, that morally, the pursuit of your own happiness, the pursuit of your own flourishing, that your own life is your moral purpose in life. Now, what Objectivism argues is that the way in which to pursue your happiness, the way in which to pursue your life and to survive as a human being, is to use your reason. It's to use your mind. It's to figure out what the rational values that are necessary for your survival are, and then to go out there and act on those values. Now, for that to be able to happen in a social context, in a context where you live with other people, you have to be protected from the one enemy of reason. And the enemy of reason is force. The enemy of reason is coercion. The enemy of reason is somebody with a gun, somebody with authority to tell you what to think and what to do, what you can do, what you can't do, what you can say, what you can't say. Somebody who can use force against you to dictate your values and to dictate your actions. That is the enemy of an egoist. That is the enemy of a moral human being trying to pursue the values necessary for his own happiness. And in order to, in a sense, institutionalize this idea of freedom, we have the concept of individual rights. Individual rights is a moral concept. It's not a political concept. It's an ethical concept. It's a concept that recognizes that individuals morally must pursue their own values, their own chosen values, using their mind, free of force, free of coercion, to attain their own happiness. And individual rights says, yes, the state, the government's only job is to create an environment in which you can do that, which means create an environment in which force is unacceptable, in which we extract, eliminate force from society so that you can go and be an egoist, so that you can go and pursue the values you believe are necessary for your own flourishing, for your own life, for your own happiness. So I think the two are necessarily connected, and you cannot have a proper conception of rights without a conception of egoism.
All right. Tan asks, in an interview with David Pakman, you said you believed resources are infinite. Explain what led you to hold that position.
Well, think about what a resource is. So I don't consider, for example, in this context, oil to be a resource. What I consider the resource to be is energy, right? So, yeah, at some point, who knows when, hundreds of years probably from today, oil will run out. Now, by then, we might be, I guess we won't find oil in asteroids because oil is organic, but we'll probably find substitutes for oil, or we will find substitutes for oil. Energy, there's infinite supply of energy. Resource, any kind of resource, let's say you need silicone for chip manufacturing. Well, it turns out there's a lot of sand in the world. But even if there wasn't a lot of sand in the world, you could probably grind up rocks to make, you could grind up certain formations, or you could artificially create silicone. I'm just making stuff up here. But the point is that human ingenuity, human creativity, will always find a way to expand and enrich the source of the resource. And there's no limit to human ingenuity. A resource is a resource only because a mind figures out how to use it for a particular purpose that serves as a value for human beings. And as long as human beings are free to use their minds, as long as human beings are free to innovate and to apply their ingenuity to the problem of survival, they will always find a solution to the problems that they face. So there's always going to be energy. There'll always be stuff from which to make chips, even if it isn't silicon anymore. Maybe it's another element. The human mind is infinite in its capacity to invent and create, and that is the sense in which resources are not finite.
So this is my own question here, but generally speaking, when people have debates, they come from different perspectives, right? And they have all these, it's not just perspectives, it's the kind of grounding they have is fundamentally different. So and a lot of times it's what you read first, right? So if your first book reading about politics and philosophy is Mises, and, then you read, Bastiat, you're going to have one position, and then you debate someone who started reading Marx and then Proudhon and then Lenin. And because people don't have an understanding of the opposing bases, it seems like they never get through to each other. How do you resolve that?
Well, that's the beauty of debates. The beauty of debates is that you get the audience exposed to a variety of different points of view. So, when I enter a debate, my goal is not to convince the person I'm debating. It's not really to convince anybody of anything. My purpose in a debate is to expose the audience that came who might be confused or might be on the other side, right? That there is something interesting in what I'm saying, that there is something worth investigating on the other side, and that they should go and study and do their research and figure it out. So I love the idea that there are lots of platforms now online that are encouraging debates between different sides. Again, the purpose of debate is not for the two people on stage to convince each other. It's for you, the audience, to be exposed to different ideas, to the different ways in which people address issues and problems. And hopefully that triggers in you a thirst to study more. So hopefully when people come away from my debates saying, I need to listen to more of this guy, or I need to pick up an Ayn Rand book and find out what's going on here, because it kind of sounded interesting. I'm not convinced, but it sounded interesting. That's all you can do. All you can do is intrigue people enough so that they use their own faculties, their own mind, their own curiosity, their own reading capabilities to go out and investigate for themselves. Unfortunately, we live in a world in which we're becoming more cocooned, more isolated, more talking to one another within bubbles. So debates break those bubbles. They open it up. They bring people from both sides, and maybe they bring people who don't have a position because they're interested in the discussion. So, but the whole idea is to expand people's universe in terms of what they read. I mean, I was a socialist until I read Ayn Rand. So. And it's just because somebody handed me a copy, handed me a copy of Atlas Shrugged, and I read that, and that blew my mind. It was completely new, it was completely different. I'd never heard anything like it. And what I hope to do in debates or in AMAs or in anything like that is to, in a sense, hand each one of the participants a copy of Atlas Shrugged and intrigue them enough to go ahead and read it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Our next question is from Electron. What is in store for the evolution of objectivism as an ideology? Are there any new additions or insights to be added in the future, or has it been explored to its fullest?
Well, it depends what you mean by objectivism. So Ayn Rand was very specific in terms of objectivism to say that she asked that the name objectivism only be used in reference to her ideas, to what she said. And in that sense, yeah, it's done. She said what she said, it's over. But if what you mean by objectivism is a philosophy of truth, a philosophy based on Ayn Rand's ideas, then the search for truth never ends. And Ayn Rand didn't say everything there is to say about philosophy. Ayn Rand didn't say everything there is to say about every topic that's going to ever come up, or that ever has come up, or ever will come up in philosophy. There's a lot of areas in application, in theory, that she either only just indicated an answer or didn't even address at all. So a huge amount of work to be done in philosophy. Now, all she asked is when you come up with an innovation or an expansion or something new, you don't call it objectivism. You call it, and I don't know what's going to be called in the future. Maybe it'll be called Randian, as indicating that you're influenced by Rand and you're building upon Rand's ideas, but it's not what she said. And that differentiation was very important to Ayn Rand. So yeah, huge amount of work still to be done to investigate the truth based on, and using Ayn Rand's platform and Ayn Rand's ideas as a sense of framework for that. There's a lot of work for philosophers. There's a lot of work for people applying the philosophy to economics, to politics, to science. Science is a huge field, to education. So no, it's far from over. A huge amount of work left to be done.
All right, and username Smelly asks, can you be a religious objectivist?
No, I mean, you can't. You can be religious and have been influenced by Ayn Rand. And I know a lot of people who are religious and heavily influenced by Ayn Rand and inspired by Ayn Rand and take some of her ideas very seriously and to heart. But at the core of Ayn Rand's philosophy is a respect for reason, that religion just can't pass that test. Religion is, by definition, based on faith, and faith is, by definition, a negation of reason. So at some point, you depart from objectivism at that point where you say, all right, I don't need evidence, I don't need proof, I just believe, I just have faith. That's when you depart, and in that sense, you cannot be consistent.
Wants to know, what are your thoughts Vegan Satanism?
I don't know what my thoughts are about Satanism, other than it just sounds like a anti-conformist religion. I don't see the point. There is no such thing as Satan. What is, if there is, there isn't such a thing as Satan. So why do we need a religion? What is the purpose of it? Why replace faith in one deity with faith in another deity? Just live your life based on reality, based on fact, based on reason, based on what's in front of you. I don't think we need all this stuff. I can understand people wanting to rebel against Christianity. Christianity is worthy of rebellion against. But I don't think the right approach is to rebel against Christianity by adopting a new religion that ultimately adopts kind of the opposite of Christianity. So, anti-conformists are really conformists because they're conforming to, by being anti-something, right? Instead of, as I view myself, as I'm an advocate for truth. If everybody agrees with me, great. If everybody disagrees with me, great. The whole point is the truth, whether it's accepted or not accepted. And that's what we should all be. We should all be truth seekers.
All right, and everyone's been talking about it recently. What are your thoughts on the recent issues, flare-ups in Israel?
Oh, wow. So I've spoken a lot about this. You just put my name in Israel in Google, and you'll find a lot of my podcast I've dedicated to this. I've done a number of lectures on this. I've done a whole series on the history of the Middle East. So I've done hours and hours and hours of lecturing on this. But my short answer would be that I believe that historically and morally, Israel is in the right when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Palestinians are in the wrong. That Palestinians have rejected peace, have adopted violence over and over and over and over again for the last 80 plus years, that Israel has tried to defend itself and done a good job defending itself, and continues to need to defend itself because the Palestinians have not given up on the idea that they can win, that they can defeat Israel, that they can wipe Israel out. I mean, there is this meme kind of thing where it says something like, you know, if the Palestinians laid down their arms and declared that they wanted peace with Israel, there would actually be peace with Israel. If the Israelis laid down their arms and declared they wanted to be peace with the Palestinians, they'd be wiped out. They'd be driven into the sea and killed. So that asymmetry says everything. The Israel needs to defend itself. I believe Israel is too moderate and weak in the way it defends itself. I think it should be even more aggressive than it is. I think until the Palestinians are thoroughly defeated, crushed, and their spirit is crushed to the point where they know once and for all that they cannot defeat Israel, that they are wrong, that their ideology is a failure. I think until they do that, then there will be no peace in the Middle East. As long as the Palestinians have even an iota of hope that they can win, they will continue fighting. And Israel needs to extinguish that hope.
All right. CRD wants to know, what is the origin of power, and at what point does it become unjust when exercised by private individuals, even if it's NAP compliant?
Well, you have to be very careful here with a word like power. What does power mean, right? Power is a very generalized term and can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. I make the differentiation between political power and economic power, and there are probably other forms of power as well, but let's just take those two. Political power is fundamentally the power of coercion. Politics is fundamentally about forcing people. It's about writing laws and enforcing those laws by force. You don't have a choice. There's no optionality. There's no alternatives. You follow the rules or force is used against you to take your money, to put you in jail, to do something to you. Political power must be limited dramatically so that it is only used in retaliation. It's only used in self-defense. So by the government, it is only used against crooks, against people who have shown themselves to be abusers of rights, to be violent themselves, if you will, or fraudulent. Economic power, on the other hand, is non-coercive. It is voluntary. You know, there's a sense in which Amazon has power over me. They can decide not to ship me anything. But I also have power over them in the sense that I can walk away and I can go and use a different service. Or I can not use the service at all. That is, there's no right to a particular product. There's no such thing. Rights are just freedoms of action. They're not claims on anybody's time, anybody's effort, anybody's product. They're not claims on anything. So in the realm of economics, power is benign. I mean, power is good in the sense that companies have a lot of money, therefore they can invest, they can increase what they offer the marketplace, they can do R&D, they can create new things, they can innovate. But they don't really have power over other people that is involuntary. You don't like what your bosses, how they behave to you, or the assignment you're given, or how much you get paid, you leave. They don't like you, they fire you. So it's a voluntary interaction, and I think there are no limits to power if the interaction is a voluntary interaction. If people are choosing to participate and no force, no coercion is involved.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Chapo asks, do states get their power by conquest? If so, why is that okay?
Well, most states have gotten their power through conquest, and it's not okay. It's just the way it's happened, right? The fact is that in almost all of human history, the way to resolve disputes has been through force. I would say that the one exception to that, at least in its founding, was the United States of America. So this country was founded not through conquest, but through revolution, but revolution based on a moral ideal, a revolution based on the idea of individual liberty, of freedom, of limiting state power. Now, granted, the founders were obviously inconsistent, and the project was an inconsistent project, and a lot of bad stuff was done, slavery, for example, post the founding of America, and even some conquest was done post the founding of America. But essentially, America was founded as a country based on an idea, not based on conquest of land. There are probably other countries, states that were founded in similar ways, but only because at some point in history, empires, which were established through conquest, broke up into smaller countries. And those countries were created not as a consequence of conquest, but just as a consequence of luck, culture, geography, and so on. I mean, who exactly did the Swiss conquer Switzerland from? I mean, at some point that land was occupied by the Roman Empire. At some point the Roman Empire disintegrated. At some point the various tribes that were in Switzerland united under some kind of federation and created Switzerland. It's not exactly conquered land. So it's true that many countries are a consequence of one people conquering another people. But that's been kind of the history of the human race, conquest and violence, and the great achievement, I think, of liberalism post-Enlightenment, liberalism in the classic sense, liberalism in the original sense, is that we don't use wars and we don't use conquest as the criteria for really anything. And indeed, we view conquest and we view violence negatively, not positively. I mean, if you're interested in kind of political questions, there's a great book that came out about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, called The Textbook of Americanism, which is about America and its founding and the principles behind what America stands for and why it's unique in history, with an essay, a lead essay by Ayn Rand that was never published anywhere else, and a bunch of essays by other people, including myself. It's called A Textbook of Americanism. It was edited by Jonathan Hoenig.
Next question is from Jordan. What's the most memorable moment from both Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged?
Wow. I mean, these are my memorable moments. I don't expect anybody else to have the same moment. Fountainhead, what's the most memorable moments from the Fountainhead? Yeah, I'm not even sure what it would be in the Fountainhead. I'll have to give that more thought. But in Atlas Shrugged, my favorite scene and the one that left a real impression on me is the scene of the first running of the John Galt line, with Dagny and Reed in the engine of this train. It's going faster than any other train has ever gone on these brand new tracks. There is a certain energy to that scene. There's a certain passion to that scene. I'd even say there's a certain sexual, sensual sense to that scene that is just inspiring and moving and thrilling. It's not an accident that right at the end of the run, or almost right at the end of the run, Dagny and Reardon have wild, passionate sex, because the way the scene is described is very sexual. So I think that scene is fantastic and is always stuck in my mind and is always inspired. It's this massive success, right? You know, those of you who haven't read Atlas Shrugged, this is a scene where everything they've worked for, everything they've been attacked for, everything they've stood up against, all these enemies that wanted to crush this project and wanted it to fail, and seem to have succeed on and off, and suddenly here they are succeeding, and nothing and nobody can stop them, and that feeling, that sense of success, that thrill of achieving your goals, very, 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 very difficult goals, work of a decade or more, and suddenly it's succeeding and you feel it viscerally. That's what that scene represents. I mean, the Fountainhead, I think the most memorable thing about the Fountainhead is its opening line. Howard Rourke laughed. And so thank you, Daniel, for reminding me of that on the Super Chat. But that concretizes so much of what the novel is about.
All right. Next question is also from Jordan. He wants to know, how do you reconcile Ayn Rand's opposition to human bondage, but complete comfort with it in the bedroom?
Well, I don't know that she had complete comfort with it in the bedroom. I mean, in terms of bondage, I can't remember any bondage scenes in any of the novels. Nobody used whips. Nobody uses that. There is passionate, passion that borders on violence, but there's no literally S&M or bondage in her descriptions. She is against violence, and she's against certainly involuntary violence. But, you could argue that mild forms of restriction in sex, or mild forms of what you might call, bondage, enhance certain experiences, elevate them, sharpen the senses. Again, as long as there's no real pain involved, and as long as there's no coercion involved, I certainly encourage people to experiment. So what Ayn Rand is doing in those scenes in Atlas Shrugged and the Fountainhead is not promoting a certain attitude towards the act of sex. But what she is doing is promoting or describing her view of sexuality and of, I'd say, feminism, masculinity in some sense. And I know I'm going to be unbelievably politically incorrect here, but who cares, right? For Rand, there is a real difference between a male and a female. Particularly, that difference comes to the forefront in the act of sex. The male is the initiator, he is more the aggressor, and he is the penetrator in the act of sex. And that has psychological implications. That is not just a purely physical description. That has attitudinal implications, the act of penetration, and the act of being penetrated. So for Rand, she's trying to illustrate a certain psychology, a psychology that is associated with the sexual act by a male versus a sexual act from a female perspective. And that's what the kind of scenes and maybe the borderline or the implication of bondage, although I don't think there's any bondage there, the implication of bondage in those sex scenes represent. It represents male versus female rather than any suggestions that violence is encouraged.
All right, our next question comes from the Twitch chat. Drunk Physics, why do you think the Free Palestine movement ignores that Jews were indigenous population, and that Zionism is an anti-colonial movement that allows Jews to rejuvenate their culture and heritage from occupations that went on for many years?
Well, I don't know why they ignore that, but I have to say, I kind of ignore it too. I don't care that there be Jews in that land for 2,000 years. I mean, so what? There have been Jews in a lot of places in the world for the last 2,000 years. I mean, the Romans evicted the Jews to Rome, and there were Jews in Italy for a long time. There were Jews in Spain for a long time. I mean, the amount of time you spend there doesn't really matter. To me, I mean, Israel was founded by not the original Jews who lived there. They were part of it, but they weren't the impetus for the founding of Judaism or for the impetus of Zionism. Zionism was a movement that was founded outside of Israel. And the movement of Zionism is basically, I consider it a movement of self-defense. It's Jews in Europe saying, we're not going to be able to survive here. They're going to kill us. And they turned out to be right, because this is 50, 60 years before Hitler, and they already see it. They're going to kill us. They're going to murder us. They're going to wipe us out. We better find somewhere else to go. Here's this land in Palestine. At the time, it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire. There'd never been a Palestinian country. The area that is considered today Israel or Palestine was part of Syria, part of Greater Syria under the Romans. It was part of Syria under the various Arab empires. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was a vast empire. Then it was part of the British, when the British conquered it from. So there's never been a country there for the last 2,000 years, since the Romans, right? So in no other place on planet Earth do we go 2,000 years back and say, okay, we're going to reconfigure the atlas so that we create it the way it was 2,000 years ago. I mean, that's absurd and ridiculous. Almost none of the people who live in Greece today, for example, supposedly lived there in ancient Greece. They're not the same people. And who cares if they're the same people? So modern Israel is a product of modern times. It is the product of modern Jews moving there in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And the reason it has a moral right to exist is because they built it. They created it. There was basically nothing really there. Yes, there were some towns and villages and some agricultural communities that were Arabs predominantly, but they were small. And there wasn't a civilization there. There wasn't a culture, a dominant culture there. They were part of a big empire, and it didn't mean much to them. The Jews brought industry. They dried swamps. They created cities. Tel Aviv was founded. They built the country up. They made something. They took something that was relatively uninhabited, and they built something significant. Many of the people who today consider themselves Palestinians or Israeli Arabs moved into the area because the Jews created jobs. They created industries. They created businesses that employed people. So they moved from Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq and places like that into the area, and today they're considered Palestinians. So the reason Israel has a right to exist is because it built something that was fundamentally free. Under Israeli law, at least theoretically, Arabs who live in Israel have equal rights to Jews who live in Israel. And generally, Israel is a free country, freer than any Arab or Muslim country in the world. Any Arab or Muslim country in the world. And we should grant it the right to exist. And we should support it, not because of some ancient story about God promising this to Abraham. I mean, every people think that God promised them something. We should respect Israel and support Israel because they're a free country that respects the rights of their own citizens, a free country surrounded by authoritarian regimes that want to destroy it. And we should be pro-freedom, anti-authoritarianism. The Palestinians either elect Hamas, which is a theocratic regime that hunts down gay people and throws them off of buildings, that rejects the rights of women, that rejects the rights of anybody who disagrees with them, including atheists who they put in jail or they stone to death. Or the Palestinian Authority, which is a secular nationalist authoritarian regime. In a fight between authoritarianism and freedom, you go with freedom every single time.
Cougar has a question. Do you support open borders for Israel?
I do when there's peace, right? It's a country at war. You can't open the borders when you're at war, and you certainly can't open the borders to your enemies. when you're at war. But when we live in a world of peace, of people who respect freedom, respect rights, real peace, then yeah, absolutely I support open borders for Israel.
All right. Let's see. Oh, Jordan has a question. Can objective morality exist without religion?
That's a great question. But of course, the flip of that question is, can objective morality exist with religion? Because religious morality is completely and utterly subjective. And as an example of that is just the fact that every religion has its own morality, because every religion has a different God and a different myth, founding myth, and a different set of commandments laid down to it by God. And not only that, but every rabbi interprets whatever the commandments happen to be in a different way, depending on his mood or depending on what revelation he's read recently. Every sect of the Protestant religion interprets these things a little differently. So is there any sense of objectivity with religion? Of course, even God changes the rules, right? You get a commandment that says, thou shalt not kill. And that's morality, right? But then when God tells Abraham, kill your eldest son, then the moral thing for Abraham to do is to do what God tells him, which is to violate the commandment. It's a complete mess. It's a complete disaster. Religious morality is completely subjective to what you think based on emotions, because you can't talk to God and you can't reason with God, so it's only whatever you emote that God has told you. What God you think God thinks is the right thing to do. So it's completely subjective and it's completely up to you. What does it mean to have an objective morality? What it means to have an objective morality is a morality that can be validated by the facts of reality. And in that sense, only objectivism provides you with the tools to validate your morality in reality, because objectivism starts with reality and derives its moral code from reality. And objectivism asks a very fundamental question. It's, why do we need reality? Why do we need morality? Well, we need morality to choose between right or wrong, to choose our values, to establish a system of values by which we will live, by which we will make important decisions. But values for what? And for whom? Right? What's the purpose of having values? And objectivism holds that this boils down to the fundamental question of, what is the value that makes all other values possible, right? And what is the fundamental choice and alternative that human beings have, that indeed nature provides us? And the fundamental choice that exists out there is the choice between life or death, existence or non-existence. And then morality, once you choose to live, the purpose of morality is to tell you how to live. It's to tell you what will lead to a successful life, what will lead to achieving survival and achieving success as a human being. And that's empirically testable. If I do X, does it lead to greater happiness? Does it lead to greater success? Does it lead to greater survival? Or does it lead to death and destruction, right? And if it leads to good things, then it's a virtue. If it leads to bad things, then it's a vice. And the standard for good things is human life, and the standard for bad things is human life. It's the destruction of human life. And that's how you derive objective morality. What are the things that lead to success in life? What are the things that lead to survival? And what are the things that destroy human life? What are the things that lead to destruction and to death? And we can test that. We can be very, very scientific and objective about that. And we might disagree about those things. But the standard for disagreement is always, okay, in reality, does that help promote human life or does that hurt human life? That's what an objective morality is, not God said X, therefore you must do it. And by the way, since God didn't speak to you, you have to interpret what he told other people and how they told the story to you.
Next question's from Whiskey Renegade. Why is individual happiness more important than the sum total happiness of all humans who will ever exist?
Because why should you care about anybody but yourself? In that context, right? Why do I care about the sum total of human happiness? I mean, it's a real question. Why? I mean, it never occurs to me. I don't live other people's lives. I'm not, I couldn't care less what happens in 5 generations after I live. My life is all I have. You don't have another life. You're not going to be reincarnated in 100 years, so you care about the state of the world 100 years from now. Now, I generally care, but only in the context of my own happiness, right? So, of course, I care about other people. I care a lot about other people. I think I care more about other people than people who claim to be utilitarians, because I understand the value of other people to me. That is, I care about other people because I care about myself. And I care about myself because it's all I have. My life is all I have. Let's say it turned out that to maximize the happiness of people 200 years from now, I need to die. Why would I do that? All I have is this life. Why would I say it's moral for me to do that? When morality is about how I should live my life. What leads to a successful life? So, no, if you ask the question, if people say, why shouldn't you live for other people, which is what the question is, my answer to that is, why should you? Give me one reason why you should. I can give you lots of reasons why I should live for myself. My main reason is this is all I have. I am me. I like me. I love me. I want to live, and I want to be happy, and I want to be successful. Why should I care about other people? Well, I have reasons for caring, but those reasons would never lead me to believe that their lives are more important than mine, except for like 3 individuals in the planet who I love so much that life without them would be meaningless, right? But that's my wife, my son, there's a limit, right? But the fact is, I don't care that much about you guys, not enough to give up my life for you, enough to do a Q&A with you, enough to engage with you, enough to trade with you, enough to be nice to you, enough to help you out if the cost wasn't too high for me, but not enough to try to maximize your happiness. I wouldn't even know how to do that. That's another problem with utilitarian concepts is there's no way to measure that. There's no way to figure out how to maximize the sum total of happinesses. There's no utility functions on your foreheads that you can maximize. All you can do, and it's hard enough to do it, is to maximize your own happiness, and that is hard work. So, focus on that, and the world would be a much, 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 much better place. If everybody just focused on maximizing their own happiness, we would live in a utopia.
Nicole wants to know, is it good that the top 1% of households have 15 times more wealth than the bottom 50% combined?
I guess it depends on how they got their wealth. If they got their wealth by stealing it, then it's not good. If they got their wealth by lying, cheating, stealing, defrauding people, then it's not good. But if they got the wealth by creating it, then yeah, it's great. Jeff Bezos got his wealth by creating it. If I met Jeff Bezos tomorrow, even though he's got, $100 billion or more than that, I would say thank you. Because he's made my life better. Even though he makes a profit over every transaction I do on Amazon, that profit doesn't represent how much he's made my life better. So I would say thank you to him. So why is it wrong for him to be a gazillionaire when he created that gazillions? And he created it by making the world a better place to live. He created it by making all of our lives better. Now, there were a lot of rich people, I don't know how many, but a lot of rich people, who stole it, or who got into bed with government and manipulated the system. Yeah, those people don't deserve it. Fine, but there is no right percentage of how much wealth should be owned by how many people. It's a question of justice. And justice is do you deserve? And desert in economics is a function of did you create? If you created the wealth through voluntary transactions, then you deserve it.
Next question from Robo42. Do you prefer Pepsi or Coke?
God, I haven't drunk either one of them in probably 20 years. When I used to drink, and I used to drink a lot, it wasn't even close. I was a Coke. I used to drink 6 cans of Coke. I liked them super, super cold, just on the verge of turning to ice. And it was not, it was one of the great pleasures in life to open a can of Coke and take that first sip, or a bottle of Coke, take that first sip. I despise Pepsi, so I still miss it. But I went cold turkey and I stopped drinking Coke a long time ago because it impacted my sugar levels. It's not good for you, put it that way. It's just not healthy.
Nicole asks, why should we frown upon altruism?
Because of what I said a little earlier. Because altruism is altruism is not being nice to people. Altruism doesn't mean opening doors and helping an old lady across the street. Altruism means otherism. It means placing the well-being of other people above yourself. It means the sacrifice of your own values for the sake of other people. Not because you value those other people, but because that's what you're commanded to do. And I say, why? Why should I sacrifice my values? I have one life, one shot at this. I have a limited time on this earth. Why should I spend it dying rather than living? Why should I spend it denying myself, sacrificing myself, rejecting my own values so that you can be happy? No, I think it's obviously an anti-life, anti-human being morality. And of course, if we were all altruists and I sacrificed to you, and that made you happy, then why are you allowed to be happy? Wouldn't you then have to sacrifice to somebody else? And you'd get this continuous sacrifice. Who would ever produce anything? Who would create anything? Who would invent anything? Who would make anything? It is a death spiral. Altruism is a term coined by the French philosopher Auguste Comte, and it's about as anti-happiness, as anti-humanity, anti-success, anti-growth, anti-happiness for everybody as one can imagine. As I said before, if everybody just took care of themselves, if everybody focused on being the happiest they could be for themselves, the world would be a gazillion times better than it is today. And note that I'm not against compassion. Compassion is not altruism. I'm not against being nice to people. I'm not even against helping people who are out of luck. I'm not even against charity. I'm against sacrificing your values, living for the sake of other people, denying yourself happiness so that other people can have something. That is evil, in my view. Because, again, you only live once. You got to make the most of it.
So what about denying yourself happiness for the sake of, for example, your children?
Well, I mean, I hope nobody puts themselves in that situation, because, in a healthy environment, in a healthy circumstances, you having children is voluntary. You have children because you want children, and you find ways, and hopefully you've thought about this in advance, to really enjoy having children. So children are great value. You shouldn't have children if you don't view them as a great value. And if they're value, then it's not a sacrifice, and it's not denying yourself happiness. Hopefully children fulfill your happiness. They help you to be happy. They help complete you. They are challenged. They are amazing. They're fun, right? Now, that doesn't mean it's not hard. It doesn't mean there are not periods of anguish and stress and worry and all kinds of things. Absolutely, that's true in pursuit of any value. But don't have children if they're not going to make you happy. Don't have children if they're going to make you miserable. Don't have children if you don't want children. Make sure the children are valued. Now, you can imagine a scenario where you have to give up your life for your children, or you have to give up your happiness for your children in some way. You know, you live into some regime or some authoritarian world, or some really bad thing has happened to you where you have to give up everything so that your children can somehow survive. And that's a choice a parent makes. Most parents value their children so much and value the responsibility they took on when they had children so much that they wouldn't want to live in a world in which they didn't do their utmost so that their children could have that life, and therefore would be willing to give up their life for their children or willing to give up their happiness. But that is in very extreme circumstances. And it is again selfish in the sense that it's only being done because your children are such a high value to you, and you chose to take on the obligation of having those children, that you cannot renege on that obligation. That is an obligation that you must fulfill, even if it costs you, some unthinkable amount, right? And I'm not talking about money necessarily, but unthinkable pain and suffering, let's say.
Tan wants to know, do you share Hans Hermann Hobbes' belief that monarchy is preferable to democracy?
No. I mean, I think it's just ridiculous. Sorry. No, monarchies are stupid. I mean, really stupid. I mean, why would you have a king? Why would you have a ruler with all power over people? A ruler that then is determined by birthright and by aristocrats that are better than everybody else. I mean, that is so anti-freedom, so anti-liberty. Hoppe is a hack, and he's certainly not a pro-freedom person. He's an anti-freedom person. So I think monarchy, one of the great achievements of the Enlightenment, one of the great achievements of the United States of America is ridding the world of monarchies. Now, democracy is not great either. And America was not founded as a democracy. It was founded as a constitutional republic. And I'm not a fan of democracy. But it pretty much anything is better than monarchy. The luck of the draw of who the monarch will be and how good or bad they decide to behave. No, I think democracies are bad, but I think monarchies are worse. And I think the best is a constitutional republic and a constitution, I think, that could be written that is better than the American Constitution and would last a lot longer. And anarchy, by the way, is the worst of all forms, because it is the institutionalization of violence and only leads to authoritarianism. It's another thing Hoppe is wrong about.
Nicole asks, why did the Ayn Rand Institute take out a loan from the Payment Protection Program despite the ideological conflict of interest?
Well, for the same reason that I'm going to collect my Social Security, right? There is a system out there that I did not create, that I object to, that I reject. I'm anti-Social Security. I think Social Security should be phased out, abolished ultimately. But I paid into it. It exists. And it would be sacrificial of me not to get my money back. The employees and the contributors of the Ayn Rand Institute pay taxes, are going to be taxed for the Payment Protection Program. The government is going to give that money. So all our enemies should get that money, but we shouldn't, even though we paid, we all paid into it, and we're going to use it in order to create a government, hopefully one day, that never bails anybody out. I mean, that would be, again, self-sacrificial and I think ridiculous of us to do. Now, granted, it's a PR challenge to explain that, but morally, I have no qualms about taking back the money, and I have no qualms in taking the money and using it for a cause that ultimately would eradicate the programs like that from ever existing.
American Legend would like to know, how would you solve the issue of climate change under your worldview?
Well, I wouldn't solve it, right? No one person is going to solve it. But in a laissez-faire capitalist world, the issue of climate change would be solved through voluntary action. That is, first, you would have to convince people that it really was a problem. People would then invest immense amounts of resources in trying to solve the problem. And they would not focus their efforts on destroying civilization, which is what I think most efforts today are dedicated at. For example, in a laissez-faire economy, you would have vast efforts right now, both scientific and technological and entrepreneurial, to develop nuclear technologies to produce electricity, which is clearly the cleanest form of electricity, which is clearly the solution if fossil fuels are creating a problem. It's to shift to nuclear power. And the way to shift to nuclear power is to get rid of all the government regulations, controls, limitations, subsidies, and so on, that are, well, not subsidies, but everything negative that the nuclear industry has to face. To let entrepreneurs build nuclear power plants. I mean, Bill Gates has an idea for nuclear power plants that has basically no waste, that actually uses nuclear waste to produce electricity. They won't let him build the plant. They won't let him try it out. Now, and environmentalists are against it. So the solution to electricity is nuclear power, and it's the global warming the people who are hysterical about global warming who won't let us shift to nuclear power. In a free market, we'd shift like that to nuclear power. It would be cheap. It would be easy. Today, in a free market, you would have small nuclear power plants. They could drive a neighborhood. You wouldn't have to have these massive nuclear power plants. Who knows what kind of technologies we would have today if we actually freed up the human imagination, human ingenuity, and the ability to innovate, and feed them up to experiment and to try different things. It's hard to imagine the kind of world we would live in. You would also, in a world like that, you would not reject attempts by some people to invest money. Universities are doing this in some parts of the world, to develop technologies that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, for example. The last thing you would do is shut down power plants. Is the last thing you would do in a free market is invest in solar and wind, which are unreliable, which require massive amounts of energy to build, to maintain, to sustain, that are very, very inefficient and don't meet any market standards. So if you really, really cared about climate change, you would invest in nuclear, and you would invest in mechanisms to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there are some amazing technology down the pipe to do that, including technologies that take CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn them into something else, which could actually be a profit opportunity for somebody. So you would have actual technological and innovative solutions rather than top-down central planning, a complete, disastrous and useless solution to the problem. I'll give you one quick example. Germany decided they're going to cut their CO2 emissions. So they decommissioned nuclear power plants for some bizarre reason, and they decommissioned coal plants, and they built solar energy plants and windmills. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Germany, but it's not exactly the sunniest country in the world. So what they discovered is that they have no sunlight at nighttime. That's surprising, I know, but there's no sunlight in nighttime. There's no energy produced in nighttime. And even during the day, there's not a lot of sunshine in Germany. So energy production in Germany fell dramatically. And they literally had to recommission coal plants and start producing coal again in order to produce electricity in Germany. And that, of course, raised their CO2 emissions, didn't decrease them. So it was solar and wind are completely, utterly counterproductive. They are a solution that only a government central planner could come up with. The market would never come up with solutions like that. So I would leave it to the market, and I think the market's an amazing thing. And if we have any hope to deal with climate change, it is the market that would solve it. If climate change is a problem, and I'm not convinced it is. It's happening. I know it's happening. But the question is it a problem?
Right. So just a little bit of timekeeping here. We're at the 1 hour mark. I'm good to keep going for another about 30 minutes if you are.
Sure. This is fun.
Awesome. Next question we've got is from Extremo McCool. What's your opinion on the death penalty?
I'm a mixed opinion of the death penalty. On the one hand, if somebody murders somebody else, they lose their right to life, and it's okay for them to die morally. The problem is that the system can result in errors, can result in mistakes, and those mistakes can generate the outcome of innocent people being killed, and that is such a tragedy. It's so unjust that I would be against the death penalty, just to prevent anybody innocent being mistakenly executed. In cases where it was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but absolute unequivocal certainty, the person admits it, there are multiple witnesses, there's no question of guilt, then I'm fine with the death penalty. Because I don't think such a person has a right to life anymore.
So with video recordings now, it's more frequent that things like this are recorded.
So
does that make you more comfortable with the death penalty?
Not with the what do they call them? The fake kind of videos. I worry about manipulation of videos. We're getting better. Like with DNA, I think we're getting much better with video. So the closer we get to certainty, the more comfortable I am with the death penalty. One of the things that we discovered when we started using DNA is that a lot of people in death row turn out to be innocent. And, that's such a tragedy that I'd like to avoid it.
Okay. So dialing back a little bit here, there were a couple of questions popping up about what you said with climate change.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
So how would you deal with what I guess would be a freeloader problem here? I know you don't agree with this, but just, I guess, hypothetically, for argument's sake, if using green energy, if reducing emissions is going to be more costly than using fossil fuels, and people trying to maximize profit obviously wouldn't be doing that in this hypothetical, how do you reconcile the freeloader problem that would exist?
That's a narrow view of self-interest. I mean, if your self-interest, let's say climate change was catastrophic. Let's say Greta, or whatever her name is, was right and the world's going to end in 20 years. Then we all have a self-interest to pay a little bit more if there is really a solution, right? Because we want to live in 20 years. We want our kids to live in 20 years. We want to have an income in 20 years. You're not just maximizing your profits tomorrow. You're maximizing your profits over your lifetime. So self-interest kicks in and you do it. Now, what happens to the few people who don't, let's say in face of a catastrophe, don't change their behavior? Well, I'd say two things about that. One is, ostracize them. Don't talk to them. Don't sell them stuff in your store. Don't bake them a cake. Discriminate against them. Not the government. The government has no right to discriminate against anybody. But you as an individual, don't deal with them, right? Treat them badly without using violence. So that's one. I'm a big believer in using social, I can't pronounce the word, anyway, using social pressure on people. Second, who cares, right? So I don't worry about free riders. I really don't. I mean, the free riders every day, all the time, we're all free riding on Steve Jobs and on Bill Gates and on Jeff Bezos. We pay a fraction of the value that they provide for our lives. Capitalism is filled with free riders. Fine. so what? I'm interested in my values, in my happiness, in my life in 20 years from now. And if my actions right now I believe is necessary so that in 20 years from now I can be alive, then I'm not worried about Joe Schmo who's free riding off of me. I'm worried about pursuing my values right now. And people are too rational. If the threat is real, and I emphasize that, for a majority to free ride, and if a majority free rides, then they deserve the outcome they get. We all deserve the outcome we get. We live in a rotten culture, and the world will suffer the consequences of the culture that we live in.
All right. If you guys are enjoying this, please do follow us, twitch.tv/bluepolitics.
And if I can pitch my YouTube channel,
Yeah.
Yaron Book Show on YouTube, I do this 4 times a night, at least, 4 times a week, sorry, at least. So if you enjoy my answers, even if you disagree with me, go over to YouTube and subscribe to the channel.
I say 4 times a night. Oof.
Yeah, that would be a lot.
Yeah, on June 5th, you have that debate with Vosh. I'm just curious, what do you do to prepare for a debate?
Well, on a topic like inequality, really nothing. I mean, if I can't, off the cuff, debate inequality after I've written a book about it, I've debated, I don't know, dozens of times, debated the issue, then I don't really, I should be able to do it off the cuff without preparing much. If it's a new topic, depending on what the nature of the topic is, I would do research. I would prepare kind of an opening statement. I would really think through the logic of the arguments. I would maybe go listen to watch some video of my opponent and see kind of what arguments he makes. And make sure I have counter to those kind of arguments. So that's the kind of prep that I would do if it was a topic that I hadn't debated, 20 times.
All right, we've got a question from First Amender. I'm not sure if this is something that Ayn Rand had written about. If not, he has an explanation below for the scenario. Yes, can you explain the baby in the water drowning argument by Ayn Rand, and how can you justify her argument?
All right, I think I know, I think I understand what he's referring to. I think this is in the Ethics of Emergencies in the Virtue of Selfishness. She writes about this. And I'm not sure what needs an explanation, that is, what in the argument. So let me lay out the argument. Let's say you're walking down a river, and by the way, Peter Singer uses a similar example, I guess. You're walking down the shores of a river, and there's a baby or a young child in the water drowning. What do you do? And Peter Singer says, you're wearing an expensive suit, right? And Ayn Rand's position is, it depends, right? It depends. It depends on how rough the river is, how big of a risk you're taking to your own life. It depends on whether the child in the river is yours, a friend of yours, a complete stranger. It depends on what you're doing at the time. Are you rushing your own child to the hospital? And therefore, by saving the baby in the river, would you be putting your own child's life at risk? It depends on the circumstances. There's no commandment. There's no moral obligation per se to save the child in the river. And it goes back to the point I made much earlier. Your life is the standard. To what extent is the value of saving the child in the river a value to you? Now, if you're not risking your life, and if you're not sacrificing your own child or sacrificing some unbelievable important value, then, of course, any human being would jump in the river and save this child, because human beings have values to one another. The child is a potentially productive, potentially a genius, potentially somebody who will change the world. Who knows? But they, as a human being, they are value to you. I mean, people value pets. They value plants. We value life. Life is a value to us. And we don't like to see life suffer, and we don't like to see life destroyed. And therefore, we're willing to exert an effort to save the life. But how much? Am I willing basically to give up my life for a stranger's child? My answer is no. And I know that sounds cool, but I don't think it is. It's just the fact of reality that I only have one of these lives, and it's incredibly precious to me. And I'm not willing to give it up except for, very, very unusual circumstances. So it's a question of context, and it's a question of your values, and it's a question of your choice. There's no moral commandment here. That's an objective approach to morality. It's evaluating the circumstances based on your hierarchy of value, and the hierarchy of value that places your life and your values as most important.
Next question's from Rampage. Do you believe space exploration with the free market would be viable?
Yeah. I think it would be much more viable than NASA or government. And this is one of the reasons why I'm happy that people like Bezos and Elon Musk and others are gazillionaires, because the fact that they have many, many hundreds of billions of dollars allow them to invest in space exploration. If they were just millionaires, they couldn't do it. But absolutely, Robert Heinlein, who is a science fiction writer who wrote in the 50s through the 70s, I think, wrote a novel in the 1950s about private space exploration and how man would get to the moon for commercial reasons. And he basically imagined the United States government instituting a Homestead Act on the moon. So basically imagine if we said, whoever gets to the moon first and, puts a fence around a certain part of it and starts using it for mining or for building or whatever the use is, it's that portion of it is theirs. The story is called The Man Who Sold the Moon. And basically, so whoever gets to Mars first, it's theirs, their private property. So basically, let's privatize Mars and privatize it in a sense of whoever gets there first gets a chunk of it, right? Not the whole thing, but a chunk of it. Now you create a real incentive. Incentive both for people who are fascinated by space travel, but also a monetary incentive. By that, the mining, there's probably mining that can be done on the moon and on Mars that is potentially incredibly valuable, and it's theirs. It's not the states. It's not, maybe you give them a zero taxes on all the profits they generate for 100 years for being on Mars or whatever. There are lots of ways to incentivize private space travel, and I think absolutely it would be done faster, more effective, safer, by private enterprise than anything the government could pull off.
Joel notes that your camera quality is really great. He wants to know what camera you're using.
I mean, it is pretty cool. It's brand new, actually. I just installed it. It's a Sony, I think, A6600 with a Sigma f2.8. What is it? 24 to 70 or something like that. So it's a pretty expensive lens, but it's a Sony 6600 camera.
Let's see here.
Yeah, I mean, Virgin Atlantic. I was just thinking that Virgin Atlantic is trying to launch space through space tourism, right? They're trying to pay for it through people paying to be launched into space. I mean, imagine if that really took off. Imagine if that was, the constraints on that were taken away and there was real competition around that. I mean, we would get to the stars much faster than anything. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries. I know you've touched on this a bit, but Chapo asks, is morality a spook?
A spook? That is a mythology, made-up stuff. No. Morality is really, really, really important. Morality is like a map on how to live your life. You don't go to a new city without a GPS and a navigation system. Morality is like your nav system. It tells you how to navigate life. It gives you the principles by which you make important decisions in your life. And without a nav system, you would get lost. You would waste time. You would run around in circles, and you might even fall off a cliff. The same thing is true of life without morality. Now, I think conventional morality, I certainly think religious morality is a spoof. It's made up. It's out of nowhere. It's out of thin air. So what we need is an objective morality. What we need is a morality based on scientific knowledge. What we need is a morality based on empirical evidence. What we need is a morality based on an understanding of human nature, an understanding on the kind of behaviors that we must engage in reality in order to be successful. Because morality is about success. Morality is a guide to success. It's a map that leads you to life, leads you to flourishing, leads you to happiness. That's what morality is about, and it's essential. And I think we see people floundering in life. We see people, particularly as they get older, being unhappy, not achieving their goals, being resentful, being cynical. Maybe your parents are like this. And that's because they don't have the right moral compass or moral map. They don't know where they're going, and they don't know how to get there, even if they did know where they're going. That's why you have libraries full of books on self-help, because morality, conventional morality, is not teaching people how to achieve happiness. What you need is a proper morality, and I think to date, the only philosopher who's presented us with a moral system to live life as a human being is Ayn Rand. It's built on foundations laid, I think, by Aristotle, but it's Ayn Rand, and it's a shame that so few people read her and so few people take her seriously. But the fact is that she actually presents you with a GPS to navigate your life. It doesn't give you every turn. It gives you the principles by which to make a decision on which turn to make. And it's a lifesaver, and it's a happiness saver.
All right. Barn Al asks, what is Ayn Rand's problem with Kant, especially his formulations regarding duty?
Everything. Everything about his formulations regarding duty. Now, I'm not an expert on Kant, so granted, whatever I say about Kant is you're going to have to validate for yourself, because I'm certainly not an expert on the topic. But the whole concept of duty, Ayn Rand rejects. The whole concept that you have moral obligations that are separate from your own values, that are separate from the requirements of your own life. The whole idea that you somehow have categorical imperatives that are somehow mystically in your mind, in your brain, in the structure of being human, that necessitates certain action, even if that action is against your self-interest. That your happiness is not your moral goal, and indeed that happiness is suspect, because happiness might suggest self-interest, and self-interest is evil and bad, all which Immanuel Kant, I believe, held. But the whole idea of a duty ethics is wrong. It's evil. Ethics should be rationally derived from reality, and you should be able to explain it. You should be able to convince people. You should be able to debate it. It's not an imperative and a duty. It's derived through science, and therefore should be debated, discussed, and if I hold a particular morality and I think it applies to you, I should be able to show you that, to prove it to you, to convince you, to argue you into that position, not to tell you, this is your duty, do it. That is, and it's in there, and you know it implicitly. You don't know anything implicitly. Everything is either taught to you or you've come to some kind of conclusion about. But that's what needs to be undone. Ethics needs to be arrived at through reason, but a reason connected to reality, not a reason divorced from reality, as Kant does. Kant's original sin, if you will, is the fact that he divorces reason from reality.
John Adams wants to know, what are your thoughts on the Electoral College?
I mean, I'm generally supportive of the Electoral College. I'm generally supportive of efforts to separate our politicians from the will of a simple majority. So, I like the idea that senators were not directly elected. I like the idea that our representatives, not all our representatives are directly elected. So House members are directly elected. Senators were not originally. And the president is not, in a sense, directly elected. He's directly through this forum of an electoral college. And I think that's a good thing. I also think that just in terms of the politics of it, I think it prevents politicians from only engaging in campaigning in big cities, which is what the only thing they would do if we had just a straight democratic process. So it's not in my view the most important issue on the table, but generally I think a Republican form of government that separates the voting from the ultimate decision making is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Misunderstood wants to know, in our personal lives, how should we deal with someone who's harmful in a nonviolent way?
Wow, I mean, it depends, right? So the best way to deal with somebody who's harmful to you is to stay away from them, is to extricate them, to divorce your relationship from them. If it's a spouse, divorce them. If it's a family member, don't go visit them. Don't associate with them. If it's a friend, stop being their friend. If it's a bully, then you have to stand up to them. And if they're using violence, then the way to deal with them is through the police. And if they're not using violence, then if it's short of legal harassment, then find ways to separate yourself from them as much as you can. But separation, ignoring them, not giving them the satisfaction of getting you angry and upset and engaged with them. Don't engage. And of course, if it gets to it, sue them, right? If that's applicable.
All right, last question, kind of a primer for the debate, which again I'm really excited for.
Yeah.
You say to people who object to the wealth of the rich by stating that they got that through exploiting the workers?
I say that's ridiculous, that it is not based on reality, it's not based on fact, and it's not based on history. People who employ other people are not exploiting them. They're their benefactors. They're giving them an opportunity to earn a living. They're providing them with a job. Jobs don't exist without entrepreneurs. Jobs don't exist without business people. Jobs don't come into reality by a wish of a deity. Jobs are created by entrepreneurs, by capitalists, by businessmen. That combination is what creates the jobs. There is no labor without business. There is no labor without capital. There is no labor without ideas that the entrepreneur brings to the table. And by providing that labor, by providing jobs, they're allowing people who used to be dirt poor, who used to be subsistence farmers and barely survived, to raise their productivity, therefore raise their quality of life and standard of living, raise their income, and create a better life for themselves. So it is one of the great, great injustices of history that instead of thanking businessmen, and entrepreneurs and innovators and and capitalists, we condemn them. They're the greatest benefactors of the human race. They have raised us from extreme poverty to the point where we can have this discussion in Discord. And you can sit in wherever you are, all over the world, and engage in conversation. This didn't exist 10 years ago. It certainly didn't exist 250 years ago before we had capitalism and before we had the so-called exploiters of labor. In those days, we were dying before age 40. Most children were dead before the age of 10. And we were pathetically, miserably poor. It's only capitalism through businessmen that have raised our quality and standard of living to the level they are today. And we should be thankful for that. And we should be excited about the fact that they're doing it. And instead, we condemn them, resent them, hate them, tax them, regulate them, control them, and everything else.
All right. So that concludes the questions. Thank you again for coming on. It's been such a pleasure. If you enjoyed this, please do go to the Yaron Brook Show on YouTube, right?
Yes, Yaron Brook Show on YouTube or yaronbrookshow.com. On the internet, that'll link to, you can follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, or subscribe on YouTube.
All right. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and I look forward to the debate in a week or so, right? Week and a half. Bye, everybody.
See ya.